Back home, I had no contact with deaf people. Zero. I found myself living in the hearing world. I did my best to learn how to lip read to communicate and eventually got a job with the help of a small community organisation. The job didn't require any formal qualifications. Moving forward, I worked in England for 6 years, then Dublin for 4 years, and then back to Belfast where I worked on the roads. I got that job because of a mainstream community group who helped me with the process. Looking back, I was mostly immersed in hearing world, which means now I can be flexible with both words. My education was very different when I compare schools from Belfast to Dublin. The system was a big adjustment for me. Trying to write things down from the board was very testing. It was evidence I was not near the stage I should have been, but fortunately learning sign language helped me to catch up. Then in October, I went into hospital with appendicitis, which led to me being off for 4 weeks. In turn, I missed classes and fell behind again. When I returned to school in November, I did my best to catch up, but overall my education was not at standard. However, school life with my friends was great. The camaraderie, sport, chatting using sign language, playing pool was so enjoyable. Academically, I wasn't too bothered. I did like subjects like geography and maths, but other subjects I didn't really pay much attention. I travelled to and from school by train, home on Friday and back on Sunday. That time of my life was a dual experience. There were good times and bad times. After school, I was immersed in the hearing world. My parents and family were all hearing, and the lack of communication started to affect my confidence. I remember feeling very tetchy, which was coming through in my behaviour. I was so frustrated, and my overall well-being was negatively impacted on because of being deprived of visual language. I was lucky because my class were doing junior search, which is exams. My teacher wanted our sign language group to sit the junior search, but the principal was against the idea. The teacher insisted, stressing the importance of providing the chance, and she held her ground, which meant we were allowed. Actually, I achieved a higher grade than the oral group, which is clear evidence of deaf people doing better using a visual language. I was so chuffed with myself, I remember feeling yes, despite suffering taunting from the other group. When I got the results, I came out on top. We were all set to leave school, and it hit us that now would be exposed fully to the hearing world. The principal wanted us to remain and do the leaving cert, which would be the equivalent to A levels in Northern Ireland. There was myself and another girl from Northern Ireland, and for us to stay to do the leaving cert meant we would continue at school until we were about 21. In Northern Ireland, A levels would be completed at 18, and we did not want to remain at school any longer. I came home into the hearing world, and my mother insisted I should enrol for a college course. Honestly, I strenuously did not want to go to college, but I had to. And there I was, the only deaf person in the whole place. What about yourself? When I left school, my pathway wasn't clear. My mother made inquiries to find out what was available for disabled people and what opportunities I might have. We met with someone who worked in this field, and it transpired there was a training centre in Dungannon for people with disabilities. That time the term used was handicapped. It was called Parkinor. Now, we didn't have a car, so my aunt offered to drive me. I remember arriving at what looked like an old castle. When I went in there, some deaf people were there. There was people with disabilities and people in wheelchairs. I was a bit out of my comfort zone. One man who worked there was deaf, and there was a female staff member as well, and they were both using Irish and British Sign Language, which put me on the back foot. My first sign language when I was young was BSL, but it was a long time since I'd used it, and I'd quite forgotten it. Thankfully, it did come back to me in time. I learned typing, English was out of the question, cooking and sewing. I stayed there for a year, but I didn't achieve academically as I had missed too much and there were no interpreters at that time. After then, I came home and went to work as a machinist in a factory. My education achievements were very poor. At school, there was no opportunity to learn English to an acceptable level or any other academic subjects. The Christian Brothers placed a total emphasis on religion, maths, prayers, etc. I felt okay with my experience at school. I didn't have any problems. When I left school at 16, my father insisted I must go to the job market and look for a job. I got a trial working as a machinist in Belfast. After the trial was completed, after 6 weeks, I got the job based in Dunmurry. After a few years, we were cut to a 3-day week and a lot of people lost their jobs. The result was a drop in wages. Then the organisation ISL, which was employment support for blind and deaf people, got me a job. It was good and the money wasn't bad. I was happy enough there. And I met a man who became my boyfriend. Unfortunately, my parents were not happy that he wasn't deaf, and at the age of 20 they put me out of the house. That in turn led to subsequent problems between us, and I never was close to my parents after then. To be honest, that was the end of our relationship. Back then there was nothing in terms of a decent education. Absolutely nothing. People who could hear had a standard education and achieved qualifications, but for us, sadly, there was no educational opportunities at all. Yes, that's right, compared to those who could hear, there was nothing for us. I remember when I was young and at school, maybe 14 or 15, I loved school and was a strong sign language user. One Christian brother asked us what we wanted to work at when we left school, and I said I wanted to be a jockey, I wanted to race horses, and that I was suitable being slim and all. The Christian brother said, "Oh no, you can't, you need a job that's suitable for deaf people." But another job had never occurred to me. Then he asked what our parents did, and I said, "Well, my uncle works with shoes." "There you go," he said, "you should work as a shoemaker." I protested and said I didn't want to. It was a dirty job, I wanted something that was clean. Anyway, I was put in the shoe workshop and I stuck it about a month. I hated it. The teacher was deaf and he told me deaf people were skilled at shoemaking and would help me to hold the nails in my mouth to stick the soles to the shoes. It was gross. I did not want to be there. And eventually I did get moved to the sewing workshop, but before that I tried my hand at joinery. But anyway, that was no good because I messed everything up I tried to do. So I went to the sewing and it seemed like a fine job. It suited me. It was nice. It was peaceful. I made various items of clothing. Things were okay. I wouldn't say I was mad about it, but I stuck with it for a year until I left school. Yes, that's right. I remember preparing for work after school and I was in the sewing department. I enjoyed it, all the different methods of sewing. It was grand. But a boy from the shoe workshop passed by and teased me. I was mad. It was humiliating. Being annoyed, I decided I better move to the shoe workshop. I had my male ego to uphold. One guy there, his nickname was Frankenstein. Oh, he was a tough nut, but very clever. He told me I was getting it wrong, as the soles weren't being stuck on properly. So I thought about it and I came up with this idea. I decided I was going to bring in a tire and practice on it. So I went to practice on the tire, but it wasn't as clever as I thought it was going to be because the nails shot all over the place. It was very tough to get the nails into the shoes through the sole. I'll tell you what, your thumb was in jeopardy. I was in the shoe workshop too. I learned how to stick the soles onto the shoes, and that was mainly what I did. I did that for a while. And then when I left school, I went to work in a training centre. That was in Dungannon, and it was for disabled people, or handicapped as they were known at that time. and I was the only deaf person there at the beginning. It was good. It was called Parkinor, and I stayed there for 10 years. I worked in a sewing place for 4 years, and I got so fed up there. It was a hearing place, and I always got dumped the rubbish jobs, like putting zips into garments. They had to be washed first, and then the zip had to be fitted. It was all very tricky work, and they didn't want to do it. So I walked out. I went to see the priest, and then he went with me to the workplace, and they said I shouldn't have walked out. And I explained I hadn't been happy and was sick of being the butt of their ignorance on the shop floor. And he apologised because he knew what I meant. So that was why I left. Yes, Belfast seemed to be okay for deaf people, but in Derry there was very little. Shoe work was all. We were definitely discriminated against due to hearing people's ignorance. It was a painful blow to be so ardent and excited to be leaving school and going into the big world and finding out the cruel reality. The language barrier was dreadful. I felt lost and helpless due to communication difficulties. How I got a decent job was thanks to the priest. We talked about it in the deaf club, and he did his best to guide me and found an employer. They asked for my credentials, and the priest explained I didn't have any qualifications as a result of my poor education. But they agreed to take me on a trial basis, and that was my way in. At St Joseph's the education was very good. We did subjects like joinery, metalwork, etc. It was no problem to me. We lived there, we had our meals, we played. The Christian brothers beat us and that wasn't good, but the teaching was good. 100%, no problem with that. I stayed there for 6 years. I left when I was 17. That was about 1990. They wanted me to stay another year, but there was no way. I had had enough. I wondered about a career and thought about joinery, and I got in a scheme called YTP, Youth Training Programme. Everybody on the programme was hearing, and it was a massive shock. I had left school where we could use sign language, and now I was back to square one, learning how to communicate with them. My recent life had been great communicating in sign language, and now it was the opposite. It hit me hard, but I had to fight to get through it using gestures and writing things down. Then a deaf person suggested getting in touch with NIDYA, Nydia. There was a man there, Malachi and Colette and others, and they invited me to their Friday night club. I remember going along and seeing everyone using sign language, but it was BSL. So I had to start all over yet again and learn BSL. Now I am bilingual, first learning ISL and then I would say BSL by the time I was 17. It's useful to have both. There were so many barriers to employment. I really wanted joinery work but was never successful. They thought I couldn't because of my deafness. Then luckily I got some experience working. It was a family who had a deaf brother and they took me on. I enjoyed it, but in my heart I wanted to be a joiner. To work with people, build up relationships, help and support them was my passion. I had different jobs, but not in Belfast. I worked in England on 2 occasions. I worked in Manchester with deaf children who had special educational needs. For example, learning difficulties, autism, behavioural issues, the whole spectrum. And with each one, it brought their own challenges. For me, every day was like a school day, but it was a great experience. It helped me develop new skills. Back then, there was an excessive amount of religion every day. Going to Mass, it was really overboard. I had to do a lot of cleaning. I did some sewing, but mostly I had to clean to a punishing degree. No pocket money, no going out in the evening. The bedrooms had to be kept. The weekends were a repeat of the week. It was the same routine all over again. I never got to go home. A few weeks after I left school, my mother mentioned me getting a job as I needed money. With her help, I soon started working in a shirt factory. As a machinist, it was great. I made some friends with hearing people. It was a big learning curve. I have lovely memories of that time. I remember teaching them the alphabet and sign language, and it must have been catching, as it soon spread. Did you work when you left school? Yes. At school I was so distressed. I told my best friend I wanted my mother to know how much I wanted to go home. Then I got a job in a factory, and I liked it. It was a challenge trying to communicate. We used to write things down. I got there eventually. The wages were okay. It worked out about £15 a week. I got a job working with my uncle, making women's garments. Then my brother told me there were deaf people working in a shoe factory. There was 4 of them. So I tried to get a job and expecting to get an interview. They told me I could start straight away, the next morning. The deaf there taught me sign language. I was aged 20, which was quite late. Then I went to the deaf club and I was shocked. The deaf people there were signing differently. So I asked at work why they taught me differently, and they said because I'd been educated the oral way. However, it wasn't long until I was signing in the ISL structure. I've been teaching now for a long time and I love it. I didn't get a decent education at school. It was no good at all, just the same repetitive routine every day. School wanted me to stay on for exams, leaving cert, but I lived in the north. I wanted home. I knew I would achieve better at home because school was so difficult, having to lip read everything. There was no communication support at that time. It was exhausting. The eye strain and concentration wore me out. Being home was much better. As I said, my education was poor. I just wanted to go home and find a job. I was homesick and happy to be back home. I felt at home as I have 4 deaf brothers and I could easily communicate with them. Oh, 4 brothers. Did you use the same sign language? No. For example, their days of the week are 2-handed and my days of the week are 1-handed. Yes, I remember being corrected using the word every. Their sign was different to mine, but I used the female version of ISL. My first job when I was 15. It was my father's brother who got me a start working in a kitchen factory. He put in a word with the boss and I got the job. We communicated using gestures. I worked there until I was about 20. And because I was communicating using lip reading in ways that suited them, my sign language dwindled. After that, I had many different jobs in the hearing world, and then going to the deaf club, I regained my sign language again. After school, getting a job was no mean feat, being deaf. Eventually I got a job working on the roads. I enjoyed it. It was challenging working with hearing people. We all felt awkward, but soon we got there. I taught them some signs and fingerspelling. We worked all over and I stayed there for 18 years until I got sick. I had to go to hospital in Belfast and the doctor told me I shouldn't be working on the roads. Was that because of fume inhalation? Yes, and because of health and safety. There was a risk to my life. He said the fact that I couldn't hear oncoming traffic was too dangerous, which resonated with me because I'd had a few close shaves in my time. There I was, busy working and oblivious to the engine noises coming towards me. A few hairy moments, I tell you. I came close a number of times. When I left school, I went to college in Omagh. There was an ISL interpreter organised and everything was set, and then at the last minute I got let down. The college rates for interpreters weren't as good as other freelance work, and I ended up very disappointed. I knew the interpreter too, and they signed well, but I had to persevere without one. It was assumed I wouldn't cope because I was deaf, but I was able to because of my experience at school and the hard time having to write things down from the board. I actually found it easier than school, and I passed. In fact, myself and another student came top, which challenged the earlier assumption, and it was evidence that being deaf does not mean you cannot achieve. I progressed to university in Belfast, and luckily they provided an interpreter. But, sod's law, it was a BSL interpreter. I had wanted ISL, but for whatever reason it didn't happen. It was quite an adjustment for me, and to be honest, I found it a bit of a struggle initially, but I did adapt, and I did well. I passed all my assignments, and I passed the course. Then I got a job working as an electronic test technician for 7 years. That entailed checking electronic circuit boards. They had a metal detection system using headphones there, but I didn't use that obviously. I checked everything was working correctly in a baby food factory, so if anything fell into the food it would be detected and removed. For example, metal. It was important the food was immaculate and had nothing in it that could lead to being ingested. I worked with the computer to ensure the production line passed, and if it didn't, it had to be rectified. I did that, as I say, for 7 years. I was 16 when I left school. I remember before I left, one Christian brother asked me if I wanted to remain at school for 2 more years. But I happily declined. I then got a job working as a tailor. I didn't relish the thought. But when I got there was another deaf man working there. He was quite old. He could use sign language. And from talking to him, it transpired he went to the same deaf school as me, in Carrbridge, Dublin. We discussed how awful the wages were. My wages were £2 a week and he got £5 a week because he was married with a family. I was confused and I told my father about the poor wages. But he encouraged me to continue. He said, "Hold on, just wait and see." He said I had to stay and not to go on the dole, but I didn't understand what the dole meant. And he tried to explain to me, you need to work, you need wages. Anyway, I wanted another job, and I told the owner, the boss, and he offered me a raise up to £3 a week. And I told him, no, there's another job and they're offering £10. But he wouldn't budge. So I told him I was leaving. He wasn't pleased. Anyway, I went to the other job. It was in construction and I worked as a labourer. It was handy enough. I was only 18 or 19 at that time. I continued working on there, and then we got married. I had left school, I would say about 6 months, when a Belfast man visited my house. He said he could help me find a job, and he did. I worked in retail for 17 years, right up until I got married. Yes, for 17 years. It was the only job I had. I had quite a few jobs. So, I wanted something different, and I got a job working as a driver. But it was only for 1 year, because alas, the company closed down. The wages were great too. All three of us working there lost our jobs. I was very dismayed, but what could I do? Do you have any qualifications? No, I have qualifications. I left school for training. What age did you leave school? 17. I left at 20. I have my qualifications. I did the junior cert and then my leaving cert, and I passed them all. Oh, good. Before I did RSA. What's RSA? Royal something. It was an awarding body. What subjects? Maths and typing. Did you go into employment? Well, my father was ill, but before that I did work for 2 years in a factory in Limavady. Oh, the factory? Yes, we made ladies' lingerie. I was a machinist. There was 5 deaf working there, and we used a mixture of ISL and BSL. That was good then, having deaf colleagues. What about you? Did you work? No, I never worked. I've been unemployed all of my life. Then I got married and had my children. My first job was working in a factory. It was a shirt factory, and I made the cuffs. It came about because my father came with me to the interview and did the talking for me. I just sat quiet and then was told I could start on Monday. I was very nervous starting. I was shaking like a wreck. It was an all-hearing environment, and it was huge, and I was the only deaf person there. But I just kept my head down and worked. Did you enjoy working there? I had no choice. I would have preferred typing work, but I ended up in the factory. I left school and went to college and got railroaded into a computer course, which I hated, but I did it for 1 year. Once that was finished, my mother told me not to be expecting to lie around and doing nothing. So I knew there was a few deaf women working in a factory. I think about 4 or 5. So like you, I went along to the interview with my father, and he did the talking for me. And then I was told I could start. I remember always looking forward to lunchtime to have a good chat. I worked there for 1 year, which really gave me time to think, and I decided to move to Belfast and enrol in a course doing beauty and hairdressing, and the rest is history. I remember after school, my mother was very anxious for me to get a job. I was only 16 and she was rushing me to find work. I got my first job working in a factory. They were all hearing. Some of them knew me. What about you? My education was very poor. I was behind. For example, when I was 13, my reading age was 8. All the emphasis was in speech and language therapy. It was very hard work. It was the same at home. My family encouraged me to lip read. They did not want me using sign language. When I left school, I had no qualifications and just took work as an assistant cook. I did a few different jobs before I decided to try to teach sign language. I taught in the college for 25 years, and during that time I realised I needed to get qualified, as I couldn't because of my English deficit in the past. Then an opportunity came up and I went to university, and that was 2014 to 2016, and I achieved a PGCE. I learned a lot. It was a new challenge for me with different modules, but I loved teaching.